You probably wouldn't last until lunch. Not because you're weak, because the Victorian factory didn't just ask you to work hard. It tried to turn your body into part of the machine. Here's the weird part. The danger wasn't only the giant spinning belts, the crushing rollers, or the air full of lint and dust. Sometimes the thing that beat people down fastest was the clock. A bell rang, a gate shut, a foreman watched, and suddenly being a few minutes late could mean losing the money you needed for food. And if you're thinking, okay, but people survived this, right? That's the right question. Millions did. They built lives inside this system. They adapted, they bent the rules, they helped each other. Some even fought back and changed the rules for everyone. So let's put you there, not as a tourist in a costume, as a worker who has to eat, pay rent, keep your job, and make it through one more day. By the end, you'll know the real question wasn't just could you survive the factory, it was what kind of person the factory was trying to make you become. Okay, so first, where are you waking up? Not in a cute little brick cottage with a kettle whistling and birds outside the window. If you're a factory worker in a booming Victorian town, there's a decent chance you're waking up in a cramped room with several other people breathing the same stale air. Maybe family, maybe lodgers, maybe both. The walls are damp, the street outside smells like smoke, horse waste, sewage, and yesterday's cooking. If there's a shared privy, it's probably not something you want to think about before breakfast. Clean water might be nearby, or it might be a walk. And breakfast, if you have it, is not a big cheerful meal. It's bread, tea, maybe porridge, maybe a scrap of something if wages have been good and prices haven't decided to ruin your week. Here's the first survival test, and it's not dramatic. It's getting out the door on time. Victorian factory life is ruled by the bell. Before factories, a lot of work followed seasons, daylight, and tasks. You finish the milking, the weaving, the repair, the field work. Factory work is different. The machine starts when the owner says it starts. You don't drift in, you report. And if you're late, you might be fined. That means part of your wage gets taken away. If you're very late, you might be locked out for part of the day. That sounds annoying until you remember this isn't pocket money. This is rent. This is bread. This is coal for heat. So already, survival is about discipline, not the inspirational poster kind, the kind where your whole morning becomes a countdown. Now you reach the factory, and this is where the modern brain gets tricked. When we hear factory, we might picture a boring workplace. Loud, maybe unpleasant, but basically organized. A Victorian factory could be organized, sure, but organized like a storm is organized. Everything has motion, everything has rhythm, everything has consequences. In a textile mill, the floor might be packed with machines pulling, twisting, and weaving thread. Belts run overhead, shafts spin. Looms clatter so loudly that ordinary talking becomes useless. People learn gestures, lip reading, or just stop trying. The air can be hot and damp on purpose because some fibers behave better that way. Tiny bits of cotton or flax float around and get into your throat. At first you cough, then you get used to coughing. That's not the same thing as being fine. If you're working in a match factory, the danger has a different smell. Chemicals cling to your hands and clothes. In some places, white phosphorus used in matchmaking could poison workers and damage their jaws in a horrifying condition people came to fear deeply. If you're in pottery, dust can wreck your lungs. If you're around dyes, metals, or acids, your job may be quietly bargaining with your body every single day. But let's keep you in a big urban textile factory for now, because it's one of the classic Victorian survival tests. Your job might be simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. You might watch threads and tie broken ends. You might change bobbins. You might keep machines fed. If you're a child, you might be small enough to move where adults can't, which is exactly why the job can be so dangerous. Think about that for a second. In a normal world, being small means people protect you. In this world, being small can make you useful near moving machinery. And here's the truly nasty part. A lot of accidents don't happen because someone is reckless in a movie villain way. They happen because the work is repetitive, loud, exhausting, and fast. You do the same motion again and again. Your attention slips for half a breath. A sleeve catches. A finger goes where it shouldn't. A machine doesn't care that you were tired. So, could you survive the first day? Maybe, if you're careful. If someone shows you the rhythm. If you don't panic. But the factory doesn't ask if you can survive one day. It asks if you can survive the same day repeated until your body starts keeping the score. Now let's talk about time, because this is where the factory gets inside your head. A modern workday can be long, but Victorian factory hours, especially earlier in the period and in less regulated workplaces, could stretch brutally. People worked from early morning into evening, often 6 days a week. The exact hours depended on the trade, the decade, the employer, your age, and the local rules. That's important because Victorian life wasn't one frozen photograph. It changed across the century. But for many workers, the basic pattern was this: get up while it's still dark, work until your body feels emptied out, go home, sleep, repeat. And the machine sets the pace. That's the thing people miss. If you're digging a garden, you can slow down when your arms burn. If you're carrying something heavy, you can shift your grip. In a factory, the machine keeps moving. It doesn't care if your head hurts. It doesn't care if your child was sick last night. It doesn't care if you haven't eaten enough. This is why factory discipline became such a big deal. Owners didn't just need workers. They needed workers who arrived on time, followed rules, didn't stop the line, didn't damage materials, and didn't challenge the pace. So they used fines, foremen, clocks, locked gates, and dismissal. Some rules were about safety or order. Others were about control. You could be fined for lateness, talking, leaving your station, spoiling material, or breaking a rule that might feel tiny but mattered to the employer. Imagine your boss charging you money because your tired hands made a mistake while doing exhausting work. That's not just a bad day. That's a system. And yet, people adapted. Workers learned the unofficial rules. Who was strict? Who could be reasoned with? Which machine sounded wrong before it broke? Which older worker could help you without making it obvious? Survival often depended on this hidden map of the workplace. The factory had its official rules. Workers had their own. Now, what about food? This sounds basic, but it's one of the biggest questions. Could you eat enough to keep doing the job? Victorian factory wages varied a lot. Skilled adult men could earn more. Women often earned less. Children earned much less. Different towns and trades had different rates. But for many working families, survival wasn't built on one person's wage. It was a family economy. That phrase sounds tidy, but the reality is rough. It means multiple people in the household may need to earn money. A father, a mother, older children, sometimes very young children, depending on the period and place. Everyone's little stream of income flows into the same desperate bucket. So when people ask why parents sent children into factories, the answer isn't usually because they didn't care. It's because poverty can make cruel choices look like the only choices. If a child's wage helps pay rent or buy bread, keeping that child home may feel impossible. That's the part that makes the whole thing harder to judge from a comfortable distance. You can hate child labor, and you should, but you also have to understand the trap. A law can say a child shouldn't work such long hours. A family still has to eat on Monday. Food itself is another survival puzzle. Bread is central. Tea is everywhere, partly because boiling water makes it safer, and partly because tea is comforting when life is not. You might eat potatoes, porridge, cheese, onions, bacon if you can afford it, maybe meat on better days. The poorer you are, the more your diet leans on cheap filling foods. And when food prices rise, everything gets tense. Think about it this way. If you're wealthy, expensive bread is annoying. If you're poor, expensive bread is an alarm bell. Rent doesn't pause. The factory doesn't say, "Oh, grain prices are high, take a break." Your body needs fuel, and the work keeps taking it. So you learn to stretch meals. You learn which shopkeeper might give credit. You learn who in the neighborhood is also struggling. Debt becomes normal. Pawning things becomes normal. Not because people are foolish, but because a weekly wage can turn life into a series of narrow bridges. And then someone gets sick. That's when the whole bridge shakes. Because the factory worker's body isn't just a body, it's the income machine. If your body fails, money stops. If money stops, rent, food, and dignity are all in danger at once. So let's ask the next question. What does the factory do to your body over time? At first, you might notice the obvious things. Your feet hurt, your back aches, your ears ring after a day in the noise, your throat is raw, your hands are nicked, rough, and stained. Then there are the slower things. Lungs irritated by dust, eyes strained in poor light, joints worn by repeated motion, skin damaged by chemicals or heat, sleep that never quite catches up. If you're a child or teenager, long hours and poor nutrition can affect growth and development. And here's the weird part, some dangers become invisible because everyone around you has them. If half the room coughs, coughing feels normal. If everyone is exhausted, exhaustion feels normal. If a worker loses a finger, people are horrified, but they also know the machines will be running again. The factory teaches you what to accept. That's one of the most disturbing survival skills, lowering your idea of normal. But we shouldn't imagine workers as passive victims just standing there. They had knowledge, practical, sharp, workplace knowledge. They knew how to move around machines. They knew which loose clothing was dangerous. They knew when to keep a hand back. They knew when a foreman was looking. They knew how to save energy in small ways without getting caught. A new worker might be at serious risk not because they're physically weaker, but because they don't know the dance. The factory has choreography. Step here, not there. Reach now, not then. Listen for that sound. Never trust that belt. Don't stand where that thing can swing. And still, the risk doesn't go away. Because machines are powerful, and the pressure to keep production moving can turn safety into an inconvenience. Guards on machines cost money. Slowing down costs money. Training costs time. If a worker is replaceable, the moral math gets ugly very fast. That word replaceable sits at the center of Victorian factory life. If you're a skilled mechanic or experienced spinner, you have leverage. If you're a desperate laborer with 10 people waiting for your job, you have less. The factory owner doesn't need to hate you for the system to be cruel. He just needs to treat your suffering as cheaper than preventing it. And now we get to children, because this is the part everyone thinks they understand, and then it gets more complicated. Yes, children worked. Yes, some were very young. Yes, the work could be dangerous and exhausting. Reformers, inspectors, journalists, doctors, and workers themselves exposed conditions that shocked the public. Over time, laws limited children's hours, required some schooling, and tried to make factories safer. But here's the part that matters. Reform was slow, uneven, and often resisted. A law on paper doesn't instantly change every workshop. Inspectors can only inspect what they can reach. Employers can bend rules. Families can hide ages. Children can be moved, coached, or kept in places where enforcement is weaker. And smaller workshops often slipped through attention more easily than famous giant mills. So if you're a child worker, your survival depends on a strange mix of law, family need, employer behavior, local enforcement, and luck. Imagine being small enough to be sent under machinery, old enough to understand fear, but not powerful enough to refuse. That's not just labor. That's childhood being reorganized around someone else's profit. But there's another piece people forget. Work could also bring pride. That sounds uncomfortable, but it's true. A young worker might feel grown, useful, needed. Earning wages could mean status inside the family. Factory communities had friendships, jokes, rivalries, songs, courtships, and routines. People don't stop being fully human because their conditions are harsh. That's what makes the story more powerful, not less. Victorian workers weren't living symbols of misery. They were people making life inside narrow limits. Now let's move outside the factory gates, because surviving the shift is only half the test. You go home and the city is still part of the machine. Industrial towns grew fast, sometimes faster than housing, sanitation, and local government could handle. Workers packed into streets built near mills, factories, canals, railways, and smoke. The air could be thick with coal soot. Laundry hung out to dry might come back dirty. Buildings were often crowded. Disease spread more easily where people lived close together with poor drainage and unsafe water. So the factory drains you, and the neighborhood doesn't necessarily restore you. If you're lucky, home is a place of warmth and support. If you're unlucky, it's damp, crowded, and tense. If you're a woman, your day may not end when the factory bell releases you. Paid work can be followed by cooking, cleaning, childcare, washing, mending, and managing the household budget down to the last coin. This is where the survival question changes shape. Could you survive as a Victorian factory worker if you were a single adult man with steady wages and a decent lodging? Maybe. Could you survive as a mother working long hours, caring for children, stretching food, and dealing with sickness in a cramped room? That's a different test. Victorian society talked a lot about respectable domestic life, but for working women, the neat idea of a home separate from work often didn't fit. The wage economy reached right into the kitchen, and respectability mattered a lot. Being respectable meant being seen as clean, sober, hardworking, orderly, and morally proper. It could affect how neighbors judged you, how charities treated you, and how employers saw you. But respectability cost money. Clean clothes require time, water, soap, and space. A stable home requires rent. Good behavior is easier when hunger isn't shouting at you. So workers weren't only fighting poverty, they were fighting the shame attached to poverty. That's a heavy thing to carry after a 12-hour day. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. Because if factories were so brutal, why didn't everyone just leave? Some did. People changed jobs, moved towns, returned to rural work, emigrated, or tried different trades. But leaving wasn't simple. Where would you go? What money would pay for the move? Who would hire you? What if your family depends on the wages right now? Factories were awful in many ways, but they also offered something powerful. Cash wages, regular money. Not always enough, not always fair, but money you could hold, count, and spend. For people leaving rural poverty, domestic service, or uncertain seasonal work, factory work could look like a path, not just a prison. That's the uncomfortable twist. The factory could exploit you and still be better than your other options. History is full of choices like that. Bad versus worse, risk versus hunger, injury versus eviction. And once a whole town depends on factory wages, the factory becomes more than a workplace. It becomes the center of gravity. Shops depend on workers. Landlords depend on workers. Churches, pubs, clubs, and schools grow around them. The factory whistle becomes part of the town's heartbeat. So if you want to survive, you don't just need strong hands. You need a network. Neighbors matter. Family matters. Friendly societies matter. These were groups where members paid small amounts into a shared fund that could help during sickness or death. Unions matter when they exist and when they're strong enough. Chapel groups, mutual aid, workplace friendships, and informal credit all matter. A worker alone is fragile. A worker inside a community has more ways to absorb shock. But community also has pressure. People notice if you drink your wages. People notice if you fall behind. People notice if your children look neglected. In a crowded street, privacy is thin. So your survival strategy becomes social. Keep good relations. Know who can lend. Know who gossips. Know which foreman might give a second chance. Know when to speak and when to keep quiet. And then comes the question that changes everything. Can workers fight back? The answer is yes, but not like in a simple movie scene where everyone rises up and wins by dinner. Workers resisted in lots of ways. Some were quiet, slowing the pace when possible, protecting a fellow worker, ignoring a petty rule until forced, taking unauthorized breaks, leaving for a better employer when the chance came. Some resistance was open: strikes, petitions, union organizing, public meetings, testimony to reformers, campaigns for shorter hours and safer conditions. Workers and their allies pushed the idea that the factory should not have unlimited power over human life. But fighting back carried risk. You could be fired, you could be blacklisted, you could lose wages during a strike, your family could suffer before the employer did. That's why collective action mattered. One worker refusing is vulnerable. Many workers refusing can become a force. Still, change came unevenly. Victorian Britain saw factory laws expand and inspectors gain more authority. Children's work was restricted more than before. Women's and young people's hours were regulated in many factories. Education requirements grew. Safety rules improved. Public attitudes shifted. But don't picture a clean rescue. Reform didn't instantly make factory life gentle. It narrowed some of the worst abuses, created new standards, and proved that the old excuse, "this is just how industry works," wasn't the final word. That's a huge deal. Because the factory system wanted to present itself as natural. Machines run, workers obey, profit flows. If people suffer, that's unfortunate, but necessary. Reformers and workers challenged the necessary part. They asked, necessary for whom? And that's where the final third of this story gets bigger than one worker's day. Because surviving as a Victorian factory worker isn't only about dodging machines and eating enough bread. It's about living through one of the moments when time itself got redesigned. Before industrial factory life, many people certainly worked hard. Let's not romanticize the past. Farm labor could be brutal. Domestic service could be exhausting. Poverty was not invented by factories. But factories changed the relationship between people and time. The clock became a boss. The bell became a command. The day became divided into units that could be bought, sold, measured, punished, and optimized. That sounds normal to us because we inherited it. But for many Victorian workers, this was a new kind of discipline. Your worth at work became tied to punctuality, speed, regularity, and obedience to a system you didn't control. The factory didn't just produce cloth, matches, pottery, tools, or metal goods. It produced habits. Show up, keep pace, don't waste motion, accept supervision, repeat. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How much of that still feels familiar? Different workplaces, different laws, different safety standards, massively different lives, yes. But the idea that your time can be sliced, monitored, priced, and judged by productivity did not vanish. It got upgraded. That's why this story isn't just old-time misery. It's part of the origin story of modern work. The Victorian factory worker stands at the point where human bodies and industrial time collide. Some people were crushed by that collision, some endured it, some organized against it, and all of them helped force society to answer a question we still argue about now. How much should a job be allowed to take from a life? So let's return to you. Could you survive? If we dropped you into an early Victorian mill with no preparation, probably not well. You'd be shocked by the noise, the hours, the smell, the danger, and the lack of personal control. You'd underestimate how much skill goes into work that outsiders call unskilled. You'd make mistakes. You'd be exhausted in ways that sleep might not fix. If you had time to learn, a family network, decent health, a less dangerous job, and a later period with stronger regulation, your chances improve. You might survive. You might even build a life. People did. They fell in love, raised children, saved money, joined clubs, went to chapel, sang songs, argued politics, and found pride in skill. But survival came with costs. Your lungs might carry the factory home. Your hearing might fade. Your back might bend early. Your childhood might shrink. Your choices might be shaped by wages so tight that one illness could change everything. And that's the honest answer. Yes, you could survive as a Victorian factory worker. Millions did. But surviving didn't mean the system was acceptable. It meant people were astonishingly good at staying alive inside conditions that should never have been treated as normal. The most impressive thing about Victorian factory workers isn't that they endured machines. It's that they remained human in a world trying to measure them like machine parts. They joked in the noise. They shared food when they could. They taught newcomers how not to get hurt. They mourned accidents, challenged bosses, joined campaigns, protected children, and slowly helped drag the industrial world toward rules that recognized workers as people. So the next time you see an old photograph of a mill, don't just see brick walls and chimneys. Imagine the bell. Imagine the rush through the gate. Imagine the heat, the lint in the throat, the foreman's eyes, the tiny calculations about rent and bread. Imagine doing all of that again tomorrow. And then remember the part that matters most. The factory was powerful, but it wasn't the only force in the story. The workers were a force too. If this made you look at modern work a little differently, that's the point. History isn't just a pile of terrible things that happened before us. It's a mirror with older clothes. And sometimes, when you look closely enough, the machine is still running.